A dead silence fell over the crowded New York subway car. Time seemed to freeze as all eyes fixed on the confrontation unfolding in the priority seating area. A visibly exhausted pregnant woman stood trembling, one hand supporting her swollen belly, while a businessman in an expensive suit refused to give up his seat, his face twisted in a sneer. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. No one dared to move or speak. Then, from the back of the car, a familiar figure emerged, Keanu Reeves, dressed in his signature black coat. His presence alone commanded attention, but what he did next left everyone on that train car completely speechless. The events that followed would not only transform the lives of everyone present, but would spark a movement that reached far beyond that single moment on a rainy Tuesday evening. This story isn't just about a seat on a train. It's about dignity, compassion, and how one person's actions can create ripples that change countless lives. The businessman had no idea that his refusal to stand would lead to one of the most profound moments ever witnessed on the New York subway, or that Keanu Reeves would teach him a lesson he'd never forget. Rain pounded against the windows of the New York subway station as waves of commuters rushed to escape the bitter November cold. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across tired faces, creating a somber atmosphere that matched the weather outside. The clock had just struck 7 p.m., and the evening rush hour was at its peak, transforming the platform into a sea of umbrellas and hurried footsteps. Melania Matthews stood at the edge of the platform, her work uniform still damp from the dash between buildings. At 8 months pregnant, even the shortest distances had become a challenge. Her feet ached in her worn sneakers, reminding her of the 10-hour shift she'd just completed at the downtown diner. The weight of her unborn child pressed heavily against her spine, making each moment of standing increasingly uncomfortable. She'd picked up extra shifts this month, knowing that every dollar would count when the baby arrived. The incoming train's headlights cut through the dim station, and Melania instinctively placed one hand on her belly, bracing herself for the usual rush of passengers. As the doors slid open, she watched the familiar chaos unfold. People pushing, shoving, all desperate to claim a spot in the overcrowded car. The scene reminded her of her younger days, when she too would rush without a second thought. Now, each movement required careful calculation. Inside the train car, the air was thick with the musty scent of rain-soaked clothes and evening exhaustion. Briefcases knocked against knees, and shoulders pressed against shoulders as passengers adjusted their positions. The overhead lights flickered occasionally, casting intermittent shadows that danced across the metal poles and plastic seats. Melania managed to grab hold of a handrail, her other hand still protectively cradling her belly. The priority seating area, marked with clear blue signs showing a pregnant woman and elderly icon, came into view. Melania's eyes lit up with hope as she spotted an empty seat. But before she could make her way there, a man in an expensive charcoal suit slid into it, immediately opening his laptop and effectively blocking out the world around him. Melania's heart sank, but she knew she needed to ask. Her swollen ankles and aching back left her no choice. Little did she know that this simple request would set in motion events that would change not just her evening, but her entire life. Melania gathered her courage and took a small step toward the businessman. Her voice came out softer than intended, nearly lost in the rumble of the moving train. "Excuse me, sir," she said. "Would you mind if I sat down? I'm 8 months pregnant. The priority seats are meant for." Her words trailed off as a man barely glanced up from his laptop screen, his fingers continuing to type. The businessman, who appeared to be in his mid-40s with perfectly styled gray hair and a watch worth more than Melania's monthly rent, finally lifted his gaze. His eyes swept over her waitress uniform, lingering on the small coffee stained near the hem, before meeting her tired eyes. His response cut through the ambient noise of the train. "These seats are first come, first served. I have an important presentation to finish." A collective intake of breath rippled through the nearby passengers. An elderly woman clutching her shopping bag shook her head in disapproval. A teenager with headphones removed one earbud, watching the scene unfold with growing disbelief. Melania felt heat rise to her cheeks as other passengers began to stare. The businessman's dismissal hung in the air like a physical thing. Melania's hand instinctively tightened around her belly as the train lurched around a corner. Her legs trembled slightly with fatigue, and she could feel the beginning of tears pricking at her eyes. 8 hours of serving tables, carrying plates, and forcing smiles had already pushed her to her limit. A young woman standing nearby offered her support. "Sir," she called out, "she's clearly pregnant. Surely your presentation can wait a few stops." The businessman's jaw tightened as he looked up again, this time with visible annoyance. "Listen," he snapped, "I paid the same fare as everyone else. I don't see why I should give up my seat just because someone else made certain life choices." The cruelty of his words seemed to physically strike Melania. She took a small step backward, bumping into another passenger who steadied her with a gentle hand. The train car had grown unnaturally quiet, save for the rhythmic clicking of the businessman's keyboard and the distant rumble of wheels on tracks. More passengers began to murmur, their disapproval growing more vocal. A construction worker shifted uncomfortably in his spot, looking like he wanted to intervene, but unsure how to do so without causing a scene. An older man in a tweed jacket cleared his throat several times, clearly preparing to say something. Melania felt trapped in this moment of public humiliation. Her feet throbbed, her back ached, and now tears threatened to spill onto her cheeks. She hadn't wanted to make a scene. She'd simply needed to sit down. The weight of her unborn child seemed to increase with each passing second, and the gentle kicks against her ribs reminded her why she couldn't just walk away to another car. The businessman had returned to his laptop, a smug expression barely visible on his face as he continued typing. His dismissal was complete, his victory over the pregnant waitress absolute. Or so he thought. What he didn't notice, what none of them had yet seen, was the tall figure in the back of the car who had witnessed everything. A figure whose quiet presence was about to transform this ordinary evening commute into something none of them would ever forget. Through the sea of standing passengers, Keanu Reeves observed the scene with quiet intensity. He'd boarded the train a few stops earlier, his presence somehow going unnoticed in the evening rush. Dressed in his characteristic black coat with slightly disheveled hair, he stood at the far end of the car, one hand gripping the overhead rail. His face remained calm, but his eyes had darkened watching the businessman's cruel dismissal of the pregnant woman. The train swayed through a tunnel, and Keanu watched as Melania struggled to maintain her balance. Her exhaustion was evident in every movement. The slight tremor in her hands, the way she leaned heavily against the pole, the occasional grimace that crossed her face when the train jerked. He noticed how she kept her gaze fixed on the floor now, trying to make herself invisible after the public humiliation. The businessman continued typing, surrounded by an invisible barrier of privilege and indifference. The clicking of his keyboard punctuated the uncomfortable silence that had fallen over the car. Other passengers exchanged glances, their collective disapproval palpable, but somehow insufficient to create change. The scene painted a stark picture of urban indifference that Keanu had witnessed too many times before. As the train emerged from the tunnel, the overhead lights flickered, momentarily illuminating Melania's face. Keanu caught sight of a single tear running down her cheek, which she quickly wiped away with her sleeve. Her other hand never left her swollen belly, protective and tender even in her distress. The simple gesture stirred something deep within him, a memory perhaps, or just a basic human instinct to protect those in need. The businessman shifted in his seat, adjusting his expensive suit, completely oblivious to the ripple of tension he'd created throughout the car. His actions had transformed the usual evening commute into a mockery of human decency. The contrast between his polished exterior and the ugliness of his behavior created a dissonance that seemed to demand resolution. Keanu straightened up, his decision made. His movement was subtle but purposeful, like a shift in atmospheric pressure before a storm. A few passengers noticed him for the first time, their eyes widening in recognition. A whisper of his name traveled through the car, adding another layer of tension to the already charged atmosphere. But Keanu paid no attention to the recognition. His focus remained entirely on the scene before him, and what he was about to do would remind everyone on that train about the power of simple human kindness. Keanu moved through the crowded car with quiet determination. His presence created a natural parting in the sea of passengers, who stepped aside instinctively. The air grew thick with anticipation as he approached the priority seating area. The businessman remained absorbed in his laptop, unaware of the approaching figure until Keanu's shadow fell across his screen. Without raising his voice, Keanu addressed the businessman. The sound of his distinct voice caused several passengers to pull out their phones, sensing something extraordinary was about to unfold. "Sir," he began, his tone measured but firm, "I notice you're sitting in the priority seating area." The businessman looked up, irritation flashing across his face before recognition set in. His fingers froze over the keyboard as he realized who stood before him. "I understand you have an important presentation," Keanu continued, gesturing to the laptop. "But I also see a woman who's been working all day, carrying not just herself but another life." The businessman's face reddened, caught between embarrassment and defiance. The train car had grown so quiet that the distant screech of wheels on rails seemed thunderous. Melania stood nearby, one hand still gripping the pole, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of disbelief and emotion. The actor's unexpected intervention had transformed her moment of humiliation into something entirely different. Keanu turned to her, his expression softening. "How long have you been on your feet today?" he asked gently. 12 hours, Melania managed to reply, her voice barely above a whisper. The construction worker who had wanted to intervene earlier nodded in sympathy. A murmur of disapproval rippled through the car, directed at the businessman who now shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His laptop screen glowed with forgotten importance. Keanu turned back to the businessman, his presence somehow both gentle and unyielding. "Sometimes we forget," he said, "that the measure of a society isn't in its business presentations or market reports. It's in how we treat each other in moments like these." The businessman's facade began to crack, the weight of public scrutiny and Keanu's words clearly affecting him. "You have an important presentation," Keanu acknowledged, "but she's carrying something far more important. The contrast between what's urgent and what's truly important. That's a choice we make every day." The businessman looked around the car, seeing for the first time the faces of his fellow passengers, their expressions a mirror reflecting back the ugliness of his behavior. The laptop closed with a soft click. The businessman stood, his movements stiff with embarrassment. Without meeting anyone's eyes, he gathered his things. "I apologize," he muttered, the words barely audible. He gestured to the now empty seat, unable to look directly at Melania. "Please," he said, his voice carrying a mix of shame and genuine regret. Keanu helped Melania to the seat, ensuring she was comfortable. The simple act of kindness, performed with such natural grace, touched everyone who witnessed it. The businessman stood awkwardly for a moment before moving toward the other end of the car, his expensive suit no longer projecting the same authority it had moments before. But Keanu wasn't finished. He turned to address the entire car, his voice carrying easily in the silence. "We all have moments when we can choose kindness," he said. "Sometimes we forget that behind every face is a story we don't know." The passengers hung on his words, phones still recording, capturing a moment that would soon spread far beyond this single subway car. Melania sat in the priority seat, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. But these weren't tears of humiliation anymore. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of being seen and validated. The elderly woman with the shopping bag reached out and patted her hand in a gesture of solidarity. The teenager with the headphones offered a packet of tissues. The businessman stood at the far end of the car, his laptop clutched to his chest like a shield. His face had lost its earlier arrogance, replaced by an expression of deep contemplation. The presentation that had seemed so crucial minutes ago now felt trivial in comparison to the lesson in humanity he'd just received. The train continued its journey through the city, but the atmosphere inside the car had fundamentally changed. What had begun as a moment of cruelty had been transformed into a powerful reminder of human dignity. And while many passengers were still recording with their phones, they were capturing something more significant than just a celebrity intervention. They were witnessing a moment of genuine human connection that would soon touch lives far beyond this evening commute. As Melania sat in the priority seat, the gentle sway of the train car provided a moment of relief for her aching body. The events of the past few minutes had stirred memories of the long journey that had brought her to this point. At 32, her life had taken turns she never could have predicted when she graduated with honors in culinary arts 5 years ago. Back then, she had dreamed of opening her own restaurant. Her professors had praised her innovative take on classic American comfort food, and her final project had even caught the attention of several local restaurateurs. Melania had worked in some of New York's finest establishments, steadily climbing the kitchen hierarchy. Her future seemed bright, filled with the promise of stainless steel kitchens and perfectly plated dishes. Everything changed when she met James. He swept into her life like a whirlwind, all charm and ambitious plans. They married within a year, and James convinced her to invest their savings in his business venture. The restaurant could wait, he said. This was a sure thing. Melania trusted him, believing in the future they planned together. But James's business failed spectacularly, taking their savings with it. The stress revealed cracks in their relationship that had been there all along. When Melania discovered she was pregnant, James's reaction shattered her remaining illusions. He disappeared one morning, leaving only a note about not being ready for fatherhood. The pregnancy had been unplanned, but Melania had felt a deep connection to her unborn child from the moment she knew. The same could not be said for James, who had chosen to walk away from both of them. The upscale restaurant where she worked as a sous chef had been understanding at first, but as her pregnancy progressed, the demanding pace of kitchen work became impossible. She took the waitressing job at the diner out of necessity. The hours were long. The pay was minimal, but they were willing to work around her doctor's appointments. The owner, an elderly woman named May, often slipped her extra food at the end of her shift. Melania's tiny studio apartment in Queens barely contained a kitchen, but she still cooked whenever she could. Late at night, after her shifts, she would experiment with recipes, writing them down in a worn notebook. The baby seemed to respond to the sounds and smells of cooking, becoming more active whenever she stood at the stove. She had already decided to name her daughter Julia, after Julia Child, holding on to that small connection to her culinary dreams. The diner's regular customers had become like family, leaving extra tips when they could, and bringing in baby clothes their own children had outgrown. One elderly couple always requested her section, saying her smile reminded them of their granddaughter. These small kindnesses had kept her going through the darkest days of her pregnancy. The train's movement caused Melania to shift in her seat, and she noticed Keanu watching her with concern. The simple act of his intervention had done more than just provide her with a place to rest. It had restored a piece of her dignity that the hardships of recent months had slowly eroded. His words about the importance of kindness resonated deeply with her own experiences, both giving and receiving it. Despite everything, Melania hadn't given up on her dreams. Each tip she earned was carefully divided, a portion for rent, for utilities, for the baby's needs, and a tiny amount set aside in what she still called her restaurant fund. The amount was so small it seemed almost laughable, but it represented hope. Hope that one day she would stand in her own kitchen again, creating the food she loved. The businessman's earlier dismissal had struck a particularly painful chord because it reminded her of James, the casual cruelty, the assumption that her current situation was solely the result of poor choices rather than circumstance. But Keanu's intervention had demonstrated something else entirely. That kindness could appear in the most unexpected moments, from the most unexpected sources. The baby kicked, as if sensing her mother's emotional state. Melania placed a hand on her belly, feeling the movement beneath. Despite all the hardships, Despite the aching feet and endless hours of serving others, this little life inside her had become her motivation to keep pushing forward. What she didn't know yet was that this chance encounter on a crowded subway car was about to change everything. The video of Keanu's intervention on the subway went viral overnight. Social media exploded with clips of the confrontation. But what caught people's attention wasn't just the celebrity involvement. It was a profound truth in his words about kindness and human dignity. Melania's story began to emerge in the comments as regular customers from the diner recognized her and shared their experiences of her unwavering warmth despite her circumstances. A local news station picked up the story, interviewing several passengers who had witnessed the event. The businessman, identified as Thomas Parker, made a public apology that went beyond the typical damage control. In a heartfelt statement, he admitted that the incident had forced him to confront his own prejudices and assumptions. He announced a new corporate initiative at his firm, a partnership with local organizations to provide job training and support for single parents returning to the workforce. But the real transformation was happening quietly, away from the viral headlines. The morning after the subway incident, Keanu appeared at the diner where Melania worked. He sat at the counter, ordered coffee, and listened as she shared her story of culinary school and deferred dreams. His eyes lit up when she described her vision for a restaurant that would combine comfort food with professional techniques. The next day, Melania received a call from one of the city's most prestigious restaurant groups. They had an unusual proposal: a 6-month paid apprenticeship program, specifically designed to accommodate her pregnancy and eventual childcare needs. The position would allow her to refresh her culinary skills while learning the business side of restaurant management. Even more surprisingly, they offered flexible hours and health insurance that would begin immediately. May, the diner owner, cried when Melania told her about the opportunity. Before Melania could even worry about leaving them short-staffed, May revealed that she had already hired additional help. "You deserve this chance," May said, pressing a small package into Melania's hands. Inside was a set of professional kitchen knives, May's own set from her younger days. The apprenticeship transformed not just Melania's professional prospects, but her entire outlook on life. Working in a professional kitchen again awakened something that had been dormant inside her. Her creativity flourished, and her unique perspective as someone who had worked both sides of the restaurant industry proved invaluable. The chef mentoring her noted that her dishes carried something special, the warmth of diner comfort food elevated by classical technique. Julia was born healthy and strong, entering the world on a busy Tuesday morning. When Melania returned to the kitchen after maternity leave, she discovered that her colleagues had converted a small office into a comfortable space where she could nurse and care for the baby between shifts. The restaurant's owner, a mother herself, had instituted new policies supporting working parents, inspired by Melania's situation. The businessman, Thomas Parker, kept his word. His company's initiative grew into a comprehensive program that provided not just job training, but also childcare assistance and mentorship. He often cited his encounter on the subway as the wake-up call that changed his perspective on corporate responsibility and human dignity. Keanu's involvement didn't end with a viral moment. He became a quiet supporter of Melania's journey, occasionally stopping by to check on her progress. His foundation provided seed funding for a grant program supporting culinary students from disadvantaged backgrounds. When asked about it in interviews, he always redirected the attention to the larger issue of creating opportunities for talented people facing difficult circumstances. The subway car regulars who had witnessed the original confrontation became some of Melania's most loyal supporters. The construction workers started bringing his family to the restaurant for Sunday dinners. The elderly woman with the shopping bag knitted a blanket for Julia. The teenager with the headphones helped create a social media presence for Melania's emerging brand. As her apprenticeship neared its end, Melania found herself facing a new challenge: multiple job offers from respected restaurants across the city. But she held on to her dream of opening her own place, and now that dream felt within reach. Her notebook of recipes had grown into a comprehensive business plan, and her savings account, once depleted by James's schemes, was slowly rebuilding. The transformation wasn't just professional. Melania stood taller now, her confidence restored not just by success, but by the knowledge that kindness could appear in the most unexpected moments, changing not just one life, but creating ripples that touched countless others. The impact of that rainy evening on the subway extended far beyond Melania's personal transformation. The viral video sparked a broader conversation about kindness and social responsibility in New York City. Local news stations began featuring kindness spotlight segments, highlighting everyday acts of compassion that often went unnoticed. Thomas Parker's corporate initiative grew into a citywide movement. Other companies, inspired by the visible success of his program, began implementing their own support systems for working parents. Within 6 months, 20 major corporations in Manhattan had established similar programs, creating opportunities for hundreds of struggling parents to return to their chosen careers. The subway car itself became something of a legend. Regular commuters noticed a subtle but significant change in behavior around the priority seating area. People became more attentive, more willing to offer their seats, more aware of their fellow passengers' needs. The Transportation Authority reported a marked decrease in complaints about priority seating issues across the entire subway system. Melania's story resonated particularly strongly within the restaurant industry. Professional kitchens, traditionally known for their demanding and often unforgiving culture, began reconsidering their practices. Several prominent restaurants instituted family-friendly policies, recognizing that talent and passion for cooking shouldn't be limited by personal circumstances. The diner where Melania had worked became a symbol of hope for struggling single parents. May created a formal program offering flexible schedules and training opportunities for parents returning to the workforce. The small establishment gained a reputation as a stepping stone for those looking to rebuild their careers while managing family responsibilities. Julia's birth announcement appeared in the local paper, accompanied by a photo of Melania in her chef's whites, baby strapped to her chest as she demonstrated a cooking technique to her apprentices. The image went viral, sparking discussions about work-life balance and the importance of supporting working mothers in demanding industries. The construction worker who had witnessed the original confrontation started a social media campaign called Stand Up for Someone. The movement encouraged people to share stories of everyday interventions that made a difference in strangers' lives. His initial post, recounting the subway incident, gathered millions of views and inspired countless acts of kindness. Keanu's words about the difference between what's urgent and what's important became a touchstone for corporate culture discussions. Business schools incorporated the incident into their ethics curriculum, using it to illustrate the real-world impact of social responsibility and human-centered business practices. The teenager who had recorded the original video used her growing social media following to create awareness about pregnancy discrimination and workplace rights. Her advocacy led to a youth-led initiative promoting awareness of priority seating rights on public transportation. Even the subway car's regular commuters became unofficial ambassadors for change. They shared their first-hand accounts of the incident at community meetings and social gatherings, emphasizing how a single moment of intervention could spark widespread transformation. Their stories inspired others to speak up when they witnessed injustice, creating a ripple effect of active compassion throughout the city. 1 year after that fateful subway ride, Melania stood in front of her own restaurant on opening night. The small space in Queens had been transformed into a warm, welcoming establishment named Priority, a subtle nod to the moment that changed everything. The restaurant's concept was unique, elevated comfort food served in an environment that prioritized accessibility and community. Inside, the walls featured a single-framed photograph, the priority seating sign from that subway car, signed by Keanu Reeves. Beneath it, a simple message read, "Sometimes the most important things aren't the most urgent." The restaurant's private dining room doubled as a training space, where Melania offered free culinary classes to single parents pursuing careers in the food industry. Thomas Parker became one of Priority's most regular customers, often bringing business associates to show them how a moment of humility had transformed into a movement of change. His corporate initiative had grown into a nonprofit organization supporting working parents across the city, with Melania serving on its advisory board. Julia, now a toddler, had her own special corner in the restaurant's kitchen, a safe space where she could watch her mother work. The staff, many of whom came through May's diner training program, took turns entertaining her during quiet moments. She was growing up surrounded by the warmth of an extended family created by circumstance and kindness. Keanu occasionally stopped by, always sitting quietly at the counter, enjoying Melania's signature dishes. His foundation had expanded its culinary grant program, creating opportunities for dozens of aspiring chefs facing personal challenges. When asked about his role in Melania's success, he always redirected the praise to her resilience and talent. The subway car regulars who had witnessed the original confrontation became Priority's core customer base. The construction worker's daughter started working there part-time while attending culinary school. The elderly woman with the shopping bag hosted her grandchildren's birthday parties in the private dining room. The teenager's social media advocacy had evolved into a successful career in public relations, with Priority as her first client. On this opening night, as Melania surveyed her packed dining room, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the kitchen's polished surfaces. She saw more than just a chef or a business owner. She saw living proof that a single moment of kindness could spark a transformation reaching far beyond one person or one evening. The busy kitchen hummed with energy, tickets rolling in steadily, while the dining room buzzed with conversation and laughter. Melania touched the small Priority sign pinned to her chef's coat, a reminder of where this journey began. In the corner, Julia slept peacefully in her specially designed space, surrounded by the sounds and smells of her mother's realized dreams. Outside, the New York subway continued its endless journey through the city, carrying countless stories of struggle and hope. But in this small corner of Queens, a simple act of kindness had grown into something extraordinary, a testament to the power of human dignity and the transformative nature of compassion.